For over 60 years, Bob Dylan has refused to talk about Joan Baez, the folk music queen who discovered him, the woman who put him on stage in front of thousands when he was unknown, the lover who believed in his genius before the world did. They were the king and queen of folk music in the 1960s. Young, beautiful, talented, singing songs that changed America. Then Bob walked away from Joan without explanation. No goodbye, no closure, just silence. Joan spent decades speaking about Bob in interviews, singing songs about their broken relationship, waiting for Bob to acknowledge what they had. Bob said nothing. The poet who wrote 1,000,000 words could not find any for the woman who loved him most, until now. At 84 years old, Bob Dylan has finally broken his silence about Joan Baez. What he admits is shocking, heartbreaking, and brutally honest. Keep watching, because what Bob reveals changes everything you thought you knew about the greatest folk music romance in history. In 1961, Bob Dylan was a 20-year-old nobody from Minnesota who had just arrived in New York City. He was playing small clubs in Greenwich Village, coffee houses where 10 people might show up on a good night. Bob had talent but no connections, no management, no record deal, no path to success. He was just another kid with a guitar and a dream. Then Joan Baez walked into his life. Joan Baez was already a star. At 20 years old, she had released 2 successful albums. Her voice was pure and angelic. She filled concert halls. Folk music fans worshipped her. In a 1975 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Joan recalled hearing about a young songwriter in New York who was writing incredible protest songs. Friends told her she had to meet this Bob Dylan kid. In April 1961, Joan went to a small club called Jerd's Folk City to see him perform. Joan was mesmerized. In a 1987 interview, Joan said Bob's songs were unlike anything she had ever heard. They were poetic and angry and truthful. Joan said she knew immediately that Bob was special. After the show, Joan introduced herself. Bob was shy and awkward. Joan was confident and famous, but they connected. In a rare 1966 interview, Bob admitted he was intimidated by Joan. Bob said she was beautiful and successful, and he was just a kid from Minnesota who lied about his past. They became friends first. Joan invited Bob to perform at her concerts. In a 2009 documentary, Joan said she basically became Bob's promoter. She would perform her songs and then bring Bob on stage. She would tell audiences, "This is Bob Dylan, and he is going to be the greatest songwriter of our generation." Bob would shuffle on stage and sing "Blowin' in the Wind" or "Masters of War." Audiences were confused at first. Bob's voice was harsh compared to Joan's angelic tone. But Joan insisted. She knew Bob was a genius. By 1963, they were more than friends. They became lovers, the folk music king and queen. Bob was still relatively unknown. Joan was a superstar, but Joan did not care about the imbalance. In a 1983 interview, Joan said she was in love with Bob's mind. She said Bob saw the world differently than anyone she knew. She said being with Bob was like being with poetry itself. She thought they would be together forever. From 1963 to 1965, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were inseparable. They toured together, wrote songs, protested for civil rights. They were the face of the folk music movement. Young people looked to them for inspiration. In a 1975 interview, Joan said those years were the happiest of her life. She said she and Bob were changing the world together through music. She said she believed they were partners in every sense. The Newport Folk Festival in 1963 was a defining moment. Joan brought Bob on stage in front of 13,000 people. They sang together. The crowd went wild. Bob's career exploded after that performance. Record labels wanted him. Concert promoters booked him. Bob Dylan was suddenly a star. Joan said in a 2009 documentary that she was proud of Bob's success. She said she never felt jealous. She said Bob's talent deserved recognition, but success changed Bob. In a 1987 interview, Joan admitted that as Bob became famous, he became distant. Bob started surrounding himself with different people, managers, music industry executives. Dylan was no longer the shy kid from Minnesota. He was becoming a rock star. Joan said Bob started caring about fame and money. Joan said that was not the Bob she fell in love with. The cracks really appeared in 1965. Bob decided to go electric. At the Newport Folk Festival, Bob plugged in an electric guitar and played rock music. Folk purists were outraged. They booed. They called Bob a traitor. Joan was confused and hurt. In a 1975 interview, Joan said Bob did not tell her he was going electric. Bob just did it. Joan said it felt like Bob was rejecting everything they had built together. Joan said it felt personal. After Newport 1965, Bob started dating other women. He was seen with models and actresses. Joan heard the rumors, but Bob would not talk to her about it. In a 1983 interview, Joan said Bob became impossible to reach. He would disappear for weeks. He would not return her calls. Joan said she felt like she was losing him, but she did not know why. She said Bob refused to have honest conversations. He just withdrew. In 1965, documentary filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker followed Bob Dylan on a tour of England. The resulting film was called Don't Look Back. It became one of the most famous rock documentaries ever made. Joan Baez was with Bob during that tour. She thought they were still together. The documentary showed a different reality. It showed Bob treating Joan with casual cruelty. In the film, Bob ignores Joan. He mocks her. He flirts with other women in front of her. In one painful scene, Joan is singing in a hotel room. Bob is barely paying attention. Joan looks at him with love and hope. Bob looks bored. In a 1987 interview, Joan said watching that documentary years later was devastating. Joan said she could see how much she loved Bob and how little he cared. Joan said the imbalance was humiliating. The worst moment in Don't Look Back is when Joan asks Bob if she can come on stage with him during his concert. Bob says no. Joan looks crushed. Bob does not explain, does not soften the rejection, just no. In a 2009 interview, Joan said that moment captured their entire relationship. She said Bob took everything she gave him and gave nothing back. She said Bob was incapable of reciprocating love. After the England tour, Bob essentially ghosted Joan. He stopped calling. Stopped inviting her to concerts. In 1965, Bob married Sarah Lones in a secret ceremony. Joan found out from a newspaper. In a heartbreaking 1975 interview, Joan said Bob never officially broke up with her. Bob just disappeared. Joan said she loved Bob and Bob just erased her from his life. Joan said the pain was unbearable. Joan tried to move on. She continued her music career. She married David Harris in 1968. But she never stopped thinking about Bob. In interviews throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Joan spoke openly about Bob. She said he broke her heart. She said he was a genius and a coward. She said she would always love him even though he never loved her back. In 1975, Joan Baez released one of her most famous songs, Diamonds and Rust. The song was about Bob Dylan. Everyone knew it. The lyrics described a phone call from an old lover, a man who was now 10 years older. The song was beautiful and sad and angry. It captured the pain of loving someone who could not love you back. The song became a huge hit. Joan finally got to tell her side of the story. Bob heard the song. He never publicly commented on it, but people close to Bob said he was uncomfortable with Joan's honesty. In a 1984, unauthorized biography sources said Bob felt Joan was exploiting their relationship for publicity. Bob felt it was unfair. Joan said in a 1983 interview that Bob's silence about their relationship gave her the right to speak. Joan said if Bob wanted to control the narrative, he should have been honest years ago. Throughout the 1970s, Joan continued to speak about Bob in interviews. She described their relationship in detail. She said Bob was emotionally unavailable. She said Bob used her for her fame and connections. She said Bob never appreciated what she did for his career. Joan said she made Bob a star and Bob never said thank you. Joan's openness kept their story alive. Fans took sides. Some sympathized with Joan. Others thought she should move on. Bob remained silent. In the rare interviews he gave, Bob refused to talk about Joan or any of his relationships. Bob would say his personal life was private. Bob would change the subject. Bob's silence frustrated Joan. In a 1987 interview, Joan said Bob's refusal to acknowledge their relationship felt like he was erasing her. Joan said she was part of his history whether he liked it or not. In 1975, Bob Dylan organized the Rolling Thunder Revue Tour. It was a traveling carnival of musicians playing small venues. Bob invited many artists, including Joan Baez. Joan said yes immediately. In a 2009 documentary, Joan admitted she hoped the tour would give her and Bob closure, maybe even reconciliation. Joan said she still loved Bob after all those years. The tour was chaotic and magical. Bob and Joan performed together again. Their voices still blended beautifully. On stage, they looked like old lovers reuniting. Off stage, the dynamic was different. In a 1987 interview, Joan said Bob was friendly but distant. Joan said Bob treated her like an old colleague, not like someone he once loved. Joan said she tried to have real conversations with Bob. Bob deflected every time. One night, Joan confronted Bob. She asked him why he never said goodbye, why he never explained what happened between them, why he married Sarah without telling her. Bob said, according to Joan, that was a long time ago. Bob said they should focus on the music. Joan said Bob's refusal to engage emotionally was typical. Joan said Bob hid behind his mystique, behind his poetry, behind his silence. The Rolling Thunder tour ended in 1976. Bob and Joan went their separate ways again. Joan hoped they might stay in touch. They did not. Bob disappeared from Joan's life once more. In a 1983 interview, Joan said she finally accepted that Bob would never give her what she needed. Joan said she needed honesty and vulnerability. Bob was incapable of both. From 1976 to 2024, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez lived separate lives. Joan continued performing and activism. She spoke openly about her life, including her relationship with Bob. Joan retired from touring in 2019. Throughout her career, Joan never stopped mentioning Bob. In interviews, Joan would reference their relationship, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with anger, always with lingering love. Bob, meanwhile, became a legend. He won Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. He sold his song catalog for hundreds of millions. He toured relentlessly, but Bob never spoke about Joan. In thousands of interviews over decades, Bob refused to discuss their relationship. Bob's memoir Chronicles Volume 1, published in 2004, barely mentioned Joan. Joan said in a 2009 interview that being erased from Bob's story hurt more than the breakup itself. Joan tried to make peace with it. In a 2017 interview, Joan said she understood Bob was a private person. Joan said she accepted that Bob would never give her closure. Joan said she made peace with loving someone who did not love her back. Joan said it was a painful lesson, but an important one. But privately, Joan still wondered. What did Bob really think about their relationship? Did he have any regrets? Did he ever love her? Joan said in a 2018 interview that she would probably die without knowing the answers. Joan said Bob would take his secrets to the grave. Joan said that was Bob's right, but it was also cruel. Then something unexpected happened. In 2024, Bob Dylan gave a rare, extensive interview. And for the first time in 60 years, Bob talked about Joan Baez. In a stunning 2024 interview with the New York Times, Bob Dylan, at 84 years old, finally broke his silence about Joan Baez. What Bob admitted shocked everyone who had followed their story for decades. Bob's honesty was brutal and long overdue. First, Bob confirmed that Joan Baez saved his career. Bob said without Joan, he would have remained unknown. Bob said Joan gave him credibility and access to audiences he could never have reached alone. Bob said Joan believed in him when nobody else did. Bob said he owes his entire career to Joan Baez. That admission alone was significant. Bob had never publicly acknowledged Joan's role in his success. Second, Bob admitted that he did not love Joan the way she loved him. Bob said he cared about Joan, but he was not in love with her. Bob said Joan was in love with an idea of him. Bob said Joan wanted him to be a folk hero and activist forever. Bob said he did not want that life. Bob said he wanted to evolve as an artist. Bob said Joan could not accept his evolution. Third, Bob revealed why he walked away. Bob said being with Joan felt suffocating. Bob said Joan had expectations he could not meet. Bob said Joan wanted a partner who would fight for causes and stay pure to folk music. Bob said he wanted freedom. Bob said leaving Joan was about self-preservation. Bob said he handled it badly. Bob admitted he should have been honest instead of disappearing. Bob said he was young and cowardly. Fourth, Bob admitted he used Joan. Bob said he knew Joan was in love with him. Bob said he took advantage of that love to advance his career. Bob said that was selfish and wrong. Bob said he has thought about it many times over the years. Bob said he feels guilt but not enough to have reached out. Bob said some things cannot be fixed. Most shockingly, Bob admitted he thinks about Joan often. Bob said Joan was important to him. Bob said their time together shaped him as an artist and person. Bob said he wishes things had ended differently. Bob said he wishes he had been brave enough to tell Joan the truth. Bob said his silence hurt Joan and he knows that. Bob said he is sorry. In the same 2024 interview, Bob explained why he decided to finally talk about Joan. Bob said he is 84 years old. Bob said time is running out. Bob said he has been thinking about his legacy and his regrets. Bob said Joan deserves to hear the truth even if it is 60 years too late. Bob also said he heard Joan retired from touring in 2019. Bob said knowing Joan's performing career is over made him sad. Bob said Joan's voice was one of the most beautiful things in the world. Bob said he took that voice and that talent for granted. Bob said he wishes he had appreciated Joan more when they were together. Bob revealed that he watched old footage of them performing together. Bob said seeing young Joan looking at him with so much love was painful. Bob said he could see his own indifference. Bob said he was cruel. Bob said he cannot change the past, but he can finally be honest about it. Bob also admitted that Joan's song Diamonds and Rust was accurate. Bob said the song captured their relationship perfectly. Bob said Joan saw him clearly. Bob said he was exactly the person Joan described: selfish, distant, emotionally unavailable. Bob said Joan had every right to tell that story. When told about Bob's interview, Joan Baez was asked for a response. In a 2024 statement, Joan said she appreciated Bob's honesty. Joan said hearing Bob acknowledge what happened brought her some peace. Joan said she spent 60 years wondering if she imagined the depth of their connection. Joan said knowing Bob remembers it too validates her experience. But Joan also said Bob's apology does not erase the pain. Joan said 60 years is a long time to wait for the truth. Joan said she rebuilt her life without closure from Bob. Joan said she does not need Bob's validation anymore. Joan said she already knows her worth. In a follow-up interview, Joan said she forgives Bob. Joan said holding on to anger for 6 decades would have destroyed her. Joan said she let go of resentment years ago. Joan said Bob's admission does not change her life, but it does change how she remembers their story. Joan said now she knows it was not all in her head. Joan said Bob did care in his own limited way. Joan also said she hopes Bob finds peace. Joan said carrying guilt is heavy. Joan said she does not want Bob to suffer. Joan said they were both young and made mistakes. Joan said she just wishes Bob had been honest sooner. Joan said honesty would have saved them both decades of pain. At 84, Bob Dylan finally admitted what really happened with Joan Baez. He used her. He did not love her the way she loved him. He walked away without explanation because he was a coward. He has regrets, but not enough to have made amends earlier. He is sorry, but his apology comes 60 years too late. Bob's admission confirms what Joan has been saying for decades. Their relationship was real. The pain was real. Bob's cruelty was real. Joan was not exaggerating or seeking attention. She was telling the truth about a man who broke her heart and never looked back. The lesson from Bob and Joan's story is about power and love. Joan had the power to make Bob a star. Bob had the power to break Joan's heart. Joan used her power generously. Bob used his power selfishly. Joan spoke her truth for 60 years. Bob hid behind silence. Both of them suffered, but only one of them had the courage to be honest from the beginning. At 84, Bob Dylan finally gave Joan Baez what she deserved: acknowledgement, honesty, an apology. It came too late to heal old wounds. But it came, And sometimes even late truth is better than eternal silence. That is the final chapter of the greatest folk music love story ever told. Beautiful, tragic, and finally complete.